We're just going to be talking about integrated pest management, or IPM, for weeds, and that's all the different methods that we can use to control weeds. What we need to do first probably is define what a weed is, and then define the different types of weeds. There's a lot of terminology for weeds out there. We want to talk about weed life cycles, and then we want to talk about the different control methods. And they're generally, when we're talking IPM, split into 5 groups: prevention, cultural controls, physical or mechanical controls, biological controls, and chemical controls. And then we'll just real quickly go through how you go about developing a weed management plan. So to start off with, let's just define these terms. So a weed is basically a plant growing where it's not wanted. And here, this is actually in my garden, yes. And here we have, in this raised bed, we have common purslane, and we have some spotted spurge and some prostrate spurge. Weed is a really subjective term, like dirt. Gold dust in a sack of flour would be considered dirt, and wild roses growing in a wheat field could be considered a weed. So it's a very subjective term, so we kind of try to drill down and get a better definition. Another weed terminology that's bandied about is invasive weed. And this is a non-native species that it's not native to the ecosystem, and it's gonna cause, or likely to cause, economic, environmental harm or harm to human health. Well, this is still pretty vague because it just depends on what ecosystem you're in, whether that is an invasive weed, a regular weed, or actually a desirable plant. So they decided to go with a term called noxious weed. And these are plants that are designated by law as requiring control. And each state has their own noxious weed list, and there's a federal noxious weed list too. What happens when plants are designated as a noxious weed by that state is the owner or manager of that land has the responsibility for removing those weeds from that property and preventing the spread of those noxious weed to adjacent properties. Now, in public lands, the entity falls to whatever government entity is managing that land. So NDOT manages the roadsides and the BLM manages BLM land. But for private land, that responsibility falls to the landowner. The other term that is bandied about a lot is nuisance weed. And these are weeds that are bothersome. They can still be very difficult to control. They are not regulated by the state. You are not required by the state to control it. And here we have a picture of dandelions in the lawn, which is the bane of a lot of people's existence. So you're not required to control those dandelions, but you want to be a good neighbor, right? And taking care of weeds, both noxious and nuisance, reduces the fire hazard, reduces the amount of fuel that's available. It will save water and nutrients in the soil for the plants you want to grow, and not the weeds that are growing and taking those away from the soils. And then landscapes and public lands and rangelands just look better and perform their true functions better without the weeds. So it's important for us to try to control them. So we try to come up with a weed control plan, and using IPM, developing a weed control plan is just the same as any other sort of pest control plan. We want to identify the pest, in this case it's a weed. We want to identify the life cycle of the pest, because we want to know if there's a stage in that life cycle where the plant is most susceptible to control methods. We want to look at how large the infestation is. There are control measures that become uneconomic or unfeasible based on the size of an infestation and where the infestation is. We want to look at what all the control options are, and we want to create a plan using 2 or more control methods. And then we want to keep records. We want to keep records so we can know what we did, what worked, and what didn't work. Generally in IPM, we kind of split the control measures into 5 different categories. So we start with prevention. We have cultural and sanitation, we have physical and mechanical, we have biological controls, and we have chemical controls or pesticides. It's important to understand that integrated pest management does not say don't use chemicals. Integrated pest management says don't just use chemicals. So we identified the weed, I hope, in each of our cases, but identifying the life cycle, let's talk about that a little bit. It'll be a review for most of you. So the life cycle of a flowering plant, all the plants go through these growth stages: seedling stage, vegetative, reproductive, where it flowers and produces seed, and death or dormancy. So at the seedling growth stage, the plants are really small in size. They don't have a big root mass. They have really thin, tender little tissues. They don't use a lot of water and nutrients. And this is the best time to control almost every weed with just about every method. Oh, and this seedling shown is a purple dead nettle. The next stage that they go through is a vegetative stage, and it's really rapid growth, and it's growing roots and stems and leaves. And the increase in plant size, this occurs prior to flowering. Water and nutrient uptake is really rapid, and control becomes more difficult. It's bigger, the root system is bigger, the leaves are tougher, so it just becomes more difficult to control. And in the case of a lot of our noxious weeds, the stickers form. Then we have the reproductive growth stage, and all the energy is kind of directed towards reproduction. So you're developing flower and fruit and seeds. For perennials, this can be a good time to control it. For annuals and biennials, you're kind of too late at this point in time. And when we get to chemical controls, we'll discuss that further. And then the last stage we have is that maturity. And so the top growth kind of slows down or stops. There's not a lot of movement of water and nutrients. The plant dries down and drops its seed, called senescence. Annual and second year biennial plants die at this point. And perennial plants, the tops die in preparation for regrowth. Chemical control at this stage is generally not effective. So chemical control to mature state of plants is not effective. It's almost like I'm telling you that because it might be on the test. Another way that we have been talking about annuals and biennials and perennials, and just as a review, I want to go through that again. So annual weeds complete their life cycle in one season, and there's two different types of annual weeds. There's winter annuals, and I refer to these as the sneaky ones because they sprout in the fall, they go dormant over the winter, and then they start growing again in the really early spring. And a lot of them will start growing when the soil temperatures are too cool for most other plants to sprout and grow. Weeds in this life cycle include like Medusa head and jointed goat grass and downy brome or cheatgrass, burr buttercup, red stem fillery, sort of a mix there of noxious and nuisance weeds. The other annuals are summer annuals, and they sprout in the spring when the soil starts to warm up. They go through all the life cycles by the end of the growing season. Weeds with this life cycle are like puncture vine, yellow star thistle, pigweeds, tumbleweed, kochia. So these all reproduce by seed. So they have one job to make seed, and you have one job if you want to control them, prevent that seed production. Biennial weeds are similar to annuals, but it takes them 2 years to complete that life cycle. So they start as a seed that first year, sprout, they have a vegetative growth. A lot of the time, the first year, there'll be a rosette, and then they go dormant for that winter, and then they start growing again that second spring, and they go crazy, and they send up the flower stems and bloom, produce seed, and die. Perennial weeds live 3 or more years. These things reproduce by seed and by their roots, rhizomes, which are the below ground stems, and stolons, above ground stems like strawberry plants. So these things are really prolific because they reproduce a number of ways. A lot of noxious weeds are perennials. So when you know the life cycle, it can help with not just the timing of a control plan, but the types of control. And we'll get into that as we go through and talk. So I mentioned that integrated pest management, there's sort of 5 groupings of the control measures. And I find it helpful to think of them as a pyramid because you want the bulk of your efforts down here on prevention and cultural controls. And then you go to the physical controls, biological controls, and chemical controls. So we're just going to go through all these, starting with prevention. So one of the things you can do with prevention is just be aware of the potential problem. If you're a land manager and you've had a fire, you should be aware that you've got bare ground there now and weeds are going to come in. If you're a homeowner and you've removed vegetation from a portion of your lot, be aware weeds are going to come in there. So be aware of the potential problem and learn to identify the weeds that may be a problem in your area. You want to detect and control those weeds early. Here's a little seedling, less than a quarter. That's really easy to pinch with 2 fingers and pull. But if you let this thing get mature, it's going to have a deep root. It's going to have a lot of vegetation on top. It's going to be a bigger problem. And then don't let those weeds reproduce and add to the seed bank. So what's the seed bank? That is the viable seeds that are present in the soil, just waiting for the right moisture and temperature conditions to sprout and grow. Some weeds have seeds that can remain viable in the soil for 50 years or more. Field bindweed is one of those. Most weeds have seeds that are viable from 2 to 5 years. And so you don't want to make any more deposits to this bank. You want to always make sure that you prevent the seed production. So another prevention tactic is just to avoid removing all the existing vegetation because weeds just love to invade that bare ground. They love to come in where there's no competition. So you have to kind of resist the urge to drop the bulldozer blade and just scrape everything clear. If you do that, you have to have a revegetation plan in place in your head or on paper before you drop that blade. The other thing you want to do is, for the same reason, is just minimize disturbance because weeds will invade that disturbed ground. So try to limit your travel to existing roads or trails if possible, or establish, we're always going to drive into the site this way. Don't drive through sensitive areas, especially if you're driving through weed infested areas first, because you don't want to spread weeds to those areas. You want to try to limit the moving vehicles and equipment through the seed infested areas to prevent the spread. And wash stations may be required for a lot of public land. If you've got a weed infestation like that, you have to set up a wash station to prevent the spread. And another thing that's very interesting is just avoid leaving those piles of exposed stockpiled soil in the construction areas. There was an area in town where they did that. It was just somebody's lot and it was covered with tumbleweed by the end of the season. So this soil is just, it's bare ground for weeds too. And this stockpiled soil, it will just come in and the weeds will grow there. Another prevention is just to limit the spread. Don't transport flowering plants that you haven't identified. That is just crazy, but that is the way that Dalmatian toadflax, yellow toadflax, purple loosestrife, and even some nuisance weeds like common teasel. People have picked these plants and decided to plant them in their yard, and that's the way they're spreading the weeds. And you want to avoid transporting weed seeds. Most of these weeds are highly adapted. They've got different structures that help them spread. Stickers, burrs, etc. And so you want to check your clothing and gear if you're in a weed infested area and try to remove those seeds you find. And don't just throw them on the ground, try to sack them up. You want to avoid driving through weed infested areas. And if you do, you want to inspect your vehicle before you go into a non-weed infested area, you want to clean all the garden equipment between sites, especially from a weed infested site to a weed free site. And if you're a contractor that is doing something on public land or even on private lands, a lot of times they will insist that when you show up at site, you show up with a clean vehicle. If your vehicle is dirty, you'll be turned away. Another way to limit the spread is to try, if you're reseeding, and that can be after a fire, that can be pasture renovation, that can be a new lawn, whatever you're doing, try to use certified weed-free seed whenever possible. I know when I used to do reclamation on BLM land, it was a requirement that I had to have certified weed-free seed to do the reclamation work. But there's also certified weed-free hay, mulch, straw, gravel, aggregate materials. And if you go to the North American Invasive Species Management Association, or NIASMA website, when you click on that first page, it'll show you a map of the United States. And if you click on your state, it will tell you where you can purchase these certified materials. And if you're doing work on a lot of public lands, federal lands, or even state lands, sometimes it's a requirement that you use these materials. And then livestock. If you've got newly purchased livestock or livestock that you know has been in a weed infested area, and especially livestock that used for weed abatement, like a herd of goats that has gone out to try to take down the brush, you want to keep them in a small weed-free pasture for several days, because those weed seeds can pass through their intestinal tract completely intact. And if you put them out on a site, then you're going to inoculate the site with weeds that are already got a fertilizer encapsulating them. So let's talk.
Melody, could
Yes.
I interrupt you and ask a question?
Sure.
Okay. Does the term certified weed free mean that the source most likely contains pesticides?
It does not. It just depends on who's doing the certification. I don't know that they certify them to be weed free and organic, if that's kind of what you're asking. I'm not sure about that, but I think there's these NIASMA links are strictly certifying that the seed is weed free or the materials are weed free.
Okay, thank you.
So for all these, I kind of want to go over the pros and cons of each of them. So for prevention, it's a lot of times it's the easiest and cheapest method of control, but the con is prevention requires you to have knowledge to identify weeds, to identify their life cycles, to identify possible routes of infestation and try to eliminate that. It requires time for scouting of those disturbed areas to make sure that you catch weed infestations early. And it requires a lot of thoughtful planning and combined efforts of all parties. So if you've got a big site where you have it's public land and you have several different contractors, everybody's got to be on the same page about not spreading the weeds and preventing the spread of weeds. And the other thing is, with prevention strategies are not going to control the seed bank. The stuff in the soil is still there and you're still going to have to deal with it. So cultural control.
Melody, can you hear me? So I think we just lost Melody's audio. This is Marion. Okay.
Because
Melody, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, we lost your sound for maybe 10 seconds.
Oh gosh, okay.
But you're back, okay.
All right. You want to manage those existing plantings, and you want to make sure the plants aren't stressed or dying, because that's going to provide open space for weeds to invade. So you want to irrigate them properly. And amazingly enough, especially the native plants, overwatering can favor weeds. The native plants are used to not dealing with that much water. And same goes for fertilizer. They're used to not dealing with a lot of nitrogen in the soil. And so if you over fertilize or over water, sometimes you are actually favoring the weeds. You've got to monitor for insect pests and diseases. And again, these are going to stress the plants. And if the plants die or don't thrive or don't provide good enough cover, then the weeds can invade. You want to avoid overgrazing. A same thing goes if you overgraze, a lot of times that leaves openings for the weeds to invade and sprout. For your lawns, if you can mow them high, like 3 inches high, that kind of tends to shade out the soil surfaces and keep the weeds from sprouting. And you also want to prune your existing plants at the right time and in the right manner. Now, as far as new plants go, you want to make sure you're planting appropriate species. Make sure you've chosen plants that are adapted to the climate, the soil type, the aspect of the site, all those things. You want to plant or seed at the optimum plant densities, and that's going to favor those desirable plants so they can outcompete the weed species. And you want to plant or seed at the optimum time of the season to ensure those plants survive and thrive at the site. For sites that are being reseeded like pastures or parks, make sure you prepare that seed bed properly. You want to remove the competing weeds before planting or seeding. It shouldn't seem like I should have to say that, but you'd be surprised how many people don't remove the existing weeds. If at all possible, after you've reseeded an area, especially rangelands, if you can defer the grazing on that area for a growing season, it really helps. When I was doing reclamation, we had one site where I would go out and reseed it every fall, and I'd go out in the early spring and it was beautiful. And then the sheep would come through in about April or May, and then the BLM would say, no, that's not good enough, I can't release it. So we finally came to some sort of agreement where we wouldn't let the sheep on there for one season, and by gosh, it came back just beautiful. And you want to, in your own home gardens and things, just encourage diversity in the garden. You want to also use good planting techniques. Don't plant the plants too deep. Stake the trees, but remove those stakes by, not more than a year. And then mulch is great for reducing weeds and retaining water, but a pyramid of mulch like this around the trees, and we see this all the time, you're just asking for trouble there. You're asking for disease. You're asking for voles to get in the winter and be able to girdle the tree bark and have complete protection while they're doing so. So it's just a good idea to use good management techniques. Some other cultural controls are like sanitation. Remove all that plant debris, especially the weed seed heads, to prevent reinfestation of the same weed. It seems like you shouldn't have to say that, but you do. You can't just mow it down. You've got to remove that material. Rotate crops in the gardens or in agricultural settings. It's time honored. It's known to reduce insect pests and plant disease, but it can actually also reduce weed populations to rotate your crops. And then cover crops. You can plant cover crops because the cover crops inhibit the weeds from growing. As the sunlight warms the soil and provides the light, lots of weeds will germinate. But if you have a cover crop there, it's going to shade the soil and it's going to prevent that from happening. It also will help your soil, and you can turn it under. It's going to hang on to the nutrients. You turn it under in the spring and you haven't lost those nutrients. So what are the pros and cons of cultural controls? Managing those new plantings properly is not that expensive or time consuming. Cultural controls can also benefit the soil. Reestablishing native plant communities is a benefit to wildlife and the environment. Some of the cons are there's not always native plant cultivars or seed available for people to revegetate with. And unless those seed mixes are certified weed-free, the site can be seeded with a lot of new weeds. And cultural controls, again, do not remove the seed bank.
Melody, could I interrupt you for another question?
Sure.
Okay, this is from Melinda in chat. And she asked, so when you comment about removing plant debris and weed seed heads, she is dealing with a large scale. So any advice for a large scale?
Unfortunately, I can't speak for Montana or Utah, but I know in Nevada Department of Agriculture, when you're removing that, they want it sacked up, and they don't want you driving down the road with a truck full of weeds and blowing seeds out the back. And so it is difficult. Sometimes you can get burn permits, but it depends on the weed, because as we'll talk about here in just a minute, those weeds are fire doesn't do much for them. The seeds are still viable after a fire. So you do have to sack it up or get it in a covered vehicle, cover the back of it, and then dispose of it in a landfill. So yeah, it's a tough one when you get that big, huge mass of vegetation. It's tough to have to take care of it, but that is something you have to do. Otherwise, you're inoculating the site with the same weed. Does that answer, I hope?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so we're gonna go to mechanical or physical controls. And the first one here, we've all done this. We've all been at the working end of a shovel or a hoe or bent over pulling weeds. So these are, we want to reduce the weed infestation by disrupting the weeds or providing a physical barrier. That's what mechanical controls are. So mowing or cutting, that's going to remove some or all of the above ground portion of the plant. It works great on annual biennial weeds that haven't set seed yet. Sometimes it'll prevent seed from setting, but lots of weeds just regrow back. And so you have to do repeated mowing or cutting. And it's only really good on flat, dry areas. It can, mowing or cutting can weaken those perennial weed infestations, depleting their root reserves as they regrow several times during the seasons. So it can be used in conjunction with a later chemical control. Pulling or hoeing, that's a time-honored weed removal method. It works really good for small infestations. If you have acres and acres, it's going to be hard to find a workforce that's willing to pull or mow. People just only volunteer so much. And you want to get it when the plants are young, early in the season. They're easier to pull. Annuals and first year growth biennials have shallow roots at this point and are easy. Established perennials, on the other hand, they have deep roots and they can resprout from the fragments left in the soil. Digging using a shovel or a trowel to get more of the root can help more permanently remove the weeds because they're not going to resprout as much. Another mechanical or physical control is tilling or rototilling or cultivating or disking. This cuts and turns the soil and all the plants growing in the soil. You can do all of the pass, you can do a portion, so you're doing in between the rows of desirable plants. It's not a viable method for landscapes. It's not very viable for rangelands. It can control the annual and biennial weeds, but it doesn't control most of those perennial weeds. A lot of the perennials have creeping root systems, and chewing it up, you're just inoculating and spreading the infestation over the site because it can resprout from very small pieces of root. Perennial pepperweed does this, dandelions do this. 1/2 inch to 1 inch root piece can resprout a new plant. There's also a mechanical control or a physical control of soil solarization. This is a non-chemical method. It controls a lot of soil-borne pests. And what you do is you put the plastic down in the summertime when the sun is high and it gets very hot, and you give it 4 to 6 weeks under that plastic, and it will cook up and destroy a lot of soil-borne pests, some diseases. It'll destroy a lot of weed seeds. It can go down 12 to 18 inches of the heat. You want to make sure that the ground is wet before you put this on because the moisture in the soil will transmit the heat better. It doesn't generally control perennial weeds because they have deeper root systems, and it won't go down far enough to control them. It can knock them down. It can deplete the root reserves when it tries to regrow. And just as a caution, even though lots of soil pests are killed by this solarization, beneficial soil organisms are able to survive the solarization, or they recolonize the soil very quickly afterwards. Earthworms, for example, are thought to go down deeper to try to escape the heat. The other mechanical or physical control are mulches. Some people consider this cultural control, and there's an argument to be made both ways. I bet you everybody here has done rock or mulch, and everybody here has discovered, even though you put down the weed barrier cloth and you put down the mulch, weed seeds blow in and will grow on top of that weed cloth. So it doesn't prevent, it can help limit. So, and again, when you're adding the mulch to an existing planting, you don't want to bury that root plant crown area. You don't want to do the pyramids here. Another mechanical or physical control are fences. Now, fences are most often used to keep out problem wildlife and etc. But if the land adjoining yours is infested with tumbleweeds and you're downwind, a fence can help stop that tumbleweed from tumbling over your land, dropping seed as it goes. So a fence can kind of help prevent the spread of weeds from adjacent properties to yours. There are other barriers that you can use, but they're more useful in homes or parks, some recreational settings, but they're not very practical for rangelands, big pastures, or big cropland expanses. Row covers can be useful to keep out weeds. Usually they're put down to keep out insect pests, but they can also keep weed seed from blowing in and sprouting in the growing area underneath the cover. They're not practical for a lot of sites, and there is an expense there to install these, both purchasing them and the time to install them. So that's something to consider. Another mechanical or physical control is controlled burning. I hesitate even to mention this a lot of times because I will get homeowners thinking that it sounds like a great idea. There have been several instances here in Nevada, and I'm sure there have been instances in Utah and Montana too, where those controlled burns get away from people and they escape that control and do some damage to homes, structures, and then also, they kill humans, livestock, pets, wildlife. And for some plants, this is where you've got to identify the weed you're trying to control. Burning can actually revitalize some native plants and remove some weed plants. It can heat that top layer of the soil, sterilizing some of the weed seeds, but many weed seeds are not affected by fire. Some are actually stimulated by fire, and fire generally removes all the plant material, the stuff you want and the weeds. So it doesn't usually fire doesn't usually kill perennial weeds because those root reserves will resprout after the fire. So here's just a quick list of some fire adapted weeds. These survive and thrive under fire regimes, and some even require fire to germinate. These are weeds that may actually increase after a fire. And you can notice it's all of our little problem children here. We've got cheatgrass, we've got knapweeds, we've got medusa head, we've got some thistles, we've got all the knapweeds, and ventinata, which is another problem child, and yellow star thistle. So fire isn't always a good solution, and it's got a whole series of things you have to be very, very careful with. So I found this is intriguing to me. This is another method of physical control, and it's touted a lot in Europe. It's just starting to find a foothold in the US. I couldn't find a lot of scientific studies, but I certainly found a lot of promotional materials. And it's called a digital herbicide, and it is using electric shock to shock the plants. So there's some testing going on in the United States. So, and this was from promotional materials. The latest buzz in weed control is called digital herbicide. So it zaps those weeds with a shot of high voltage electricity, and it's supposed to kill them instantly. And apparently it's being used through Europe, and apparently it's also being used in Japan. Like I said, I couldn't find any scientific studies by universities yet. In the Midwest, they are selling the equipment, and sometimes they rent the equipment. They can use it to do a burn down or field preparation. You kill everything growing, and that's what this picture illustrates. But one of the cool things I saw, and I couldn't get the video to download, was it was a soybean crop, and they had put the electrical wire up high, and they had Palmer's amaranth, which is in the pigweed family, and it's developed a resistance to a lot of herbicides. And so it was growing up higher than the soybean crop, and they just drove the tractor through really slow and let the electrical wire hit the Palmer's amaranth that was growing above the soybean crop, and it killed it all the way down to the root. So I thought that was really interesting. And again, I hesitated to put this on here. One of the things they said was that the root type may pose a challenge because weeds that have those rhizome roots might require multiple passes. And then the electrical dose, quote unquote, is kind of dependent on the size of the weeds. Seedlings don't need a lot. Mature plants need more. And the soil type may require adjustments to the voltage if it's a sandy soil versus a clay-rich soil. And I just want to caution, I don't know what the costs are for the equipment purchase or rental. Nobody would tell me that online. I think it's one of those situations, if you have to ask, you can't afford it. And then I just want to caution people, to all my do-it-yourself friends out there. I couldn't find any information on voltage, etc. Please don't, take apart your electrical fencing and hook it to the front of your tractor and try to figure out if you can make this work. Electricity is nothing to mess around with. So you might want to do some research, but if you search digital herbicide, hopefully you'll find some interesting information. So what are the pros of mechanical or physical controls? They can be really effective for small infestations that are new. It's effective for annual, biennial weeds, especially if you initiate it before the weed form seeds. Cutting, hand pulling are useful for those small infestations in rugged terrain where large equipment can't be used. What are the cons? Pulling doesn't remove the entire root of the plant, and it will resprout. Mowing, cutting rarely kills weeds. This was a mowed bull thistle plant. And then when it grew back, it decided to grow back prostrate. And so now it's going to be under the mower if you try to remow it. Mechanical controls don't remove or control the seed bank. They can eliminate additions to it, but they don't remove the seed bank. Weeds can create bare ground, so you've got to have a revegetation plan if you're going to remove everything. Fire can be dangerous. It doesn't always destroy the roots of those perennial weeds. Mechanical controls disturb the soil, and mechanical controls can be very costly. That equipment costs and labor costs can be really high for large infestations. So biological controls for weeds. Of course, we have our grazers, livestock, or grass carp. There are insects that target weeds. This one here is a purple loosestrife plant, and it is a, I gotta remember the name, a root weevil. So this is a picture taken by Jake Dick at NDA. And the root weevils are infesting the purple loosestrife and trying to control it. And this is a disease that targets the weeds, and this is Canada thistle rust. So you're using one creature to control another. Livestock grazing can aid in the control of these noxious and nuisance weeds when they're young. Unfortunately, when they get older, what happens with these weeds is, as the name implies, barbed goat grass. It's got barbs on the awns. You've got all these thistles have stickers. Cheatgrass, once the seed heads form, that it's just not palatable to livestock anymore. So these things can be used. You can use livestock here, and it's not going to control the infestation. It's going to knock it down. It's going to use up the root reserves on these perennial plants like perennial pepperweed for them to regrow. And then you come in after the grazing and maybe use a chemical control. So the pros are this insect biological control. It can be self-perpetuating. You just have to find an insect that likes the climate you're in, doesn't mind, like here in Nevada, doesn't mind the cold winters and the hot, dry summers, and forms a stable population. If you use livestock grazing, again, you're going to deplete those root reserves of the weeds. Grass carp can keep water infestations below an action threshold. They're not going to eradicate those aquatic weeds, but they will consume enough of them to keep things low. So these are before and after pictures of salt cedar, and they released a leaf beetle, and great defoliation occurred. The population wasn't really eradicated. It started, the tamarisk population started to decline, but it prevented the spread. Unfortunately, they discovered later, after we released it here in Nevada, that the endangered southwestern willow flycatcher nests in salt cedar in Arizona and New Mexico. And so they've kind of done away with any more releases because if this is potential habitat for an endangered species, you can't really do that. So that's the other problem is that, you know, you've got to think of the whole entire food web. So what are the cons for biological controls? Again, biological controls can reduce a weed infestation, but they will rarely eradicate a weed infestation. Lots of weeds are toxic to livestock. They don't want to eat it, or it's unpalatable livestock. Not only do they not want to eat it, it can be dangerous for them to eat it. Livestock can move seed in their manure and coat, so you want to make sure you're grazing the animals not when the weeds have set seed. Insect biological controls are really slow to show results. And again, those insects may not be adapted to our climate, and biological controls rarely control the seed bank. So you've still got that seed bank to worry about. So the last control, of course, is chemical controls and herbicides. And I always feel like I have to remind people that herbicides are a pesticide. We did a survey in Nevada and we asked homeowners how often they used pesticides on their lawns, and they said never. And we said, how often do you use weed and feed? And they said, oh, 3 times a year. So a lot of people, there's a disconnect. They don't understand that herbicides are pesticides. When they hear pesticides, they think insecticide. So a pesticide is any substance or mixture of substance that's intended to prevent, destroy, repel, or mitigate any pest. That includes plant regulators, defoliants, and desiccants. How do herbicides work? They have to contact the plant. They have to penetrate or be absorbed by plant tissues. They have to reach a living site to disrupt a vital process or structure in the plant. So pesticides vary a lot, and I could take a whole hour discussing modes of action, but we're just going to sort of subdivide here into two main groups. Systemic herbicides are absorbed by the leaves or roots of the plant, transported elsewhere where they disrupt a vital function or system. Contact herbicides kill the part of the plant they contact. The roots and other plant parts may survive. And here's a really good example of a contact herbicide. They kill only the plant parts they contact. So somebody was going along the fence line here a few blocks from my house and was spraying. And I'm happy to report that the tree is still alive several years later because it just killed the leaves down here where the herbicides contacted. Pesticides also vary by their selectivity. So that's the kind of the ranges of pests that they affect. Non-selective will kill all related pests. So for weeds, a non-selective herbicide is glyphosate, in Roundup Original, kills every plant that it's sprayed on if it gets a sufficient dose. Then there's selective herbicides, and they kill only certain plants. And a good example of this is 2,4-D. That will kill broadleaf plants, but not damage grass plants. Pesticides can also vary by their persistence. How long do they remain active in the environment? Residual pesticides can remain active for weeks or months or years. It's really important to consider the persistence of the herbicides when you're developing a weed control plan. What are you going to do with that site? Do you want to immediately revegetate? Are you going to reseed? You can't use something that has a high residual. You can't use an herbicide with a high residual in that case because your reseeding program or revegetation program will fail. So it's important to consider this. Non-residual pesticides are inactivated immediately within a few days. A lot of herbicides are inactivated by exposure to sunlight. So after just a few days, they are rendered pretty inactive. Pesticides also vary by the growth stage of the plants that they target. So we have pre-emergent herbicides, and these are applied before the seeds in the soil have started to germinate. And they're applied to the soil, and they have to be watered in to be activated. And as a seed sprouts or germinates, they encounter this chemical barrier in the soil, and cell division or some other function in that very young root system is inhibited, and the seedling dies before it emerges from the soil, and that's why they're called pre-emergence. Post-emergence are chemicals that kill actively growing plants. So there can be combo products, and some of these are called soil sterilants. You'll see them in the big box stores over the counter. And it's got a pre-emergent and a post-emergent, and a lot of times will have a very high residual, and it can kills everything growing and prevents anything from growing there for 12 months, say. I think that's the longest one I've seen in just an over-the-counter general use. And so you have to be thoughtful about that. If you're using one of these soil sterilants, great for driveway cracks, great for roadsides where you don't want anything to grow for a year. Not good if it's the lawn that you were going to replant. So these next two slides are just a list of herbicides. And remember that anybody here watching this is going to be recorded. You can get this later, so don't panic about it. But we just, in our update of our noxious weed field guide that we just did, we kind of tried to look at all the different chemicals and group them. So we have post-emergent, non-selective herbicides, glyphosate plus 2,4-D. And then what we did was we listed some trade names, common trade names. This is not an endorsement. We're not saying that these are the greatest products in the universe. These are common products that people will recognize the names to go with that chemical name. So here's the post-emergent broadleaf plant selective. So we've got 2,4-D, dicamba, etc. And then the brand names, Weedar, etc. And here we have a post-emergence. So the plants are actively growing, and this is selective for controlling grass plants. It won't harm the broadleaf plants. Then on the second page here, we have those post-emergence for aquatic plants. And these are labeled to be applied in water or adjacent to water. And so that's an important consideration depending on your site. Then we have pre-emergence. Again, this is going to control the plants as they're just starting to sprout. And these are non-selective. And we have pre and post-emergence. So this is one of the combo products. And here's another combo product. The other combo products, these are non-selective for pre-emergent, but post-emergent broadly selective herbicides. So that's kind of overwhelming, but there's one on here I want to talk about because it's been in the news a lot. And it's called indaziflam. The trade name is Esplanade or Spectacle. So it's got a new kind of mode of action. It inhibits cellulose biosynthesis, and it acts as a pre-emergent in the soil. What's kind of cool about this and kind of scary at the same time is depending on formulations, it can have up to a 4-year residual in the soil. So one of the things they're touting this is they want to use it to eradicate annual grasses like cheatgrass and medusa head and bentonata, things that have seeds that live 2 to 4 years in the soil, in that seed bank. So it binds to the top inch of the soil. And so it's not supposed to harm perennial plants that have roots below that depth. So the preliminary studies so far suggest that those perennial plants bounce back. They survive and thrive when those annual grasses are controlled or eliminated in the ecosystem. So bunch grasses and some of the perennial forbs and the perennial shrubs, they are no longer have the competition from these annual grasses, and they bounce back. It's recommended that you only use this where there's a viable population of desirable perennial plants. So those big infestations where it's a complete monoculture, they're not suggesting you use that there. You could use it there, but you better have a revegetation plan for year 4 when this stuff is no longer viable. And my biggest question is, it's preventing all seeds from emerging from the soil. So what about those desirable annual and biennial species? And what about even the seeds of the perennial species? So there's a lot of studies going on in a lot of states, and it'll be really interesting to find out, give it 4 or 5 years here and let's find out how people think this is really going to work. There are a lot of different states doing test plots. And so I'm very interested to find out how things turn out.
Melody, could I interrupt
Yes.
you with another question?
Sure.
So in chat, Shauna asks if that new pre-emergent herbicide, do you know if it can be used in raspberries?
I don't believe that it's labeled for any food crops.
Okay, thank you.
It's labeled for rangelands right now. And it is a restricted use. So you would have to be a certified applicator in order to purchase it and apply it. So in keeping with that question, no matter what type of pesticide you choose, by law, you have to read, understand, and follow the label directions. You just need to know that when you buy a pesticide, you are entering into an agreement with the federal government, and your agreement is, I'm going to read, understand, and follow all label directions. The onus is on you if you screw up. So remember, we talked about annual weeds. Let's talk real quick on why that's important to know if you're going to use a chemical control. So this is a graph that's going to show the percentage of control applying an herbicide to the different growth stages in an annual. And we'll go through biennials and perennials too. So at the seedling stage here, it's 95% effective to apply an herbicide. You got a little bitty plant, tender little tissues, not deep root system. So it's pretty easy to coat it and with the herbicide and have it be effective. When you start the vegetative growth, you're increasing the plant mass, both above ground and below ground, and the control goes down to about 70% when you're applying an herbicide. Remember, annual plants have one job. Their job is to flower and produce seed. That's their one job. So once it starts flowering, the annual plant starts to die. It's not sending anything down to the roots to survive. It's done. And when it's mature, when the seed heads form, putting any kind of herbicide on it is a waste of money. It won't be effective. Remember, biennials, same sort of deal, only 2 seasons to get to that death stage. Same sort of deal with the chemical controls. 95% control at a seedling stage. Vegetative, it goes down to about 70%. Flowering, remember, biennials have one job too. They're supposed to produce seed. Once it's flowering in that second year, its job is done. And once it's produced the seed, it's not uptaking those chemicals. It's not going to uptake it and get it into the plant system to disrupt a vital process or structure. You're just wasting your money and time. Now, perennials live for 3 or more years. So this is why it's important to decide if it's an annual, biennial, or perennial that you're trying to control. Again, seedling stage, 95% control on all of these different annual, biennial, or perennial plants. Perennials are different because then they kind of go, the control goes down in that early vegetative state. And a lot of times it's because it's the second year, third year, and they've got root reserves that they're growing off of. They're not uptaking things, they're using their root reserves. But when it starts to bud and goes to full flower, because perennial plants have 2 jobs. They want to produce, the seeds. They want to flower and produce seed, but they also want to store things in the roots so they can come back next year. At this time, for a perennial plant at the bud to full flower stage, you can get 85 to 70% control doing an application of an herbicide then. And again, once it's produced the seed, it's not a good time to try to apply an herbicide. It's getting ready to die down for the end of the season. Then in the early spring, in that regrowth, you get decent control again. So chemical pros, for a lot of noxious weed infestations, a chemical control component has to be added to your management plan to control the weed. You're not going to control it. If you've got perennial pepperweed infestation and those roots can go down 10 foot, you cannot dig deep enough to get rid of all those roots. You're going to have to add a chemical control method to try to get that weed under control. For lots of large infestations, chemical control may be the most economic option because you're not going to be able to hire enough people or get enough volunteers to come out there and do mechanical control. It may be the only option in areas where you can't get mechanical control equipment in, if it's steep terrain, if it's very remote areas. For infestations where mechanical pulling, mowing, cutting will require multiple repeated visits to gain control, a chemical control may be the most economic. You can use this chemical controls in conjunction with other control methods. I gave an example, both grazing and cutting or mowing. You want to deplete those root reserves and let that plant regrow a couple times, depleting the root reserves, and then hit it with the chemical control, and you'll have a better control option. What are the cons? Well, there's potential to damage or kill the non-target plants through herbicide drift. And both this and the second one here, toxicity to humans, livestock, pets, and pollinators and wildlife. Everybody has a camera. If you're applying herbicides or any kind of pesticides, recognize everybody's got a camera. You better have it together. You better do it right. You better document everything you do. And you better be aware that there are a lot of people out there that are adamantly opposed to any kind of chemical controls. The other problem with the chemical control, especially for some of these weeds, is the weeds can develop resistance to herbicides over time. If you're doing multiple applications of an herbicide to a site, you want to choose different herbicides each time with different modes of action, because if you do that, you're less likely to develop resistance. If you apply the same herbicide over and over and over again, you're going to favor a resistant population. So it's difficult to control the weeds without damaging desirable plants in mixed plant settings. That's very difficult. If you want to use the restricted use herbicides, you've got to be certified or licensed. And herbicides, like all pesticides, have to be applied according to label directions. The label is the law. It's going to tell you everything. Chemical controls can also require special equipment, personal protective equipment, and the personal protective equipment may be different for mixing the herbicide versus applying the herbicide. And again, all that information is on the label. And those chemical controls, you've got to have applicators that are prepared in the event of a chemical spill. So you've got to have a spill kit and you've got to have your people trained. So again, very quickly, and I'm sorry I went over my time. For a weed control plan, you want to identify that weed, identify the life cycle, how large is the infestation, what are the control options, and it's perfectly okay to also consider economics in your control options. Create a plan using 2 or more methods and keep records, and please keep records. Record keeping is required for restricted use pesticides, but you should keep records of everything you're doing. It's going to help you with your timing, for scouting and monitoring for all pests, not just weeds. And if it didn't work last season, should you do it again? If you keep records of what you did and you have down that it didn't work, just because you have some of that herbicide left over, you shouldn't reapply it. I mean, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. So with that, here is my contact information. Here is our Manage MV Pest. This is our IPM website here in Nevada. And this is a link again to that NIASMA for the weed-free products. And I have to mention that this project was supported by NIFA and an IPM grant that we have through NIFA.